Okay, so chapter 8, it's a very interesting chapter. I mean, it's all the details about the Revolutionary War. As far as how heavily it's tested on, I would say it's about average. Remember, you don't have to know the specific details of any military strategy. It's just not covered on the AP test, although I'm going to cover it a little bit just because I think it's good to know. So, you have the Second Continental Congress. Remember, the colonies had sent a bunch of representatives to Philadelphia to kind of figure out, you know, what do we do? We have this Lexington and Concord has already happened. We got these bunch of Americans with guns all surrounding Boston. The Olive Branch petition didn't work, so what do we do now? And so they meet in May 1775. Every colony is represented. They also start passing a whole bunch of different appeals and bills to Britain. They're saying we're not ready to declare independence. We still want to be loyal British subjects, but at the same time, they know that hostilities are well underway, and how do you deal with that? And so this now American Congress basically starts securing money, trying to get loans from different people, different countries, and creates an army and a navy. Probably the most important thing is what they do is George Washington, who showed up at the Second Continental Congress and just kind of hung in the back of the room in his full military uniform, the Congress basically turned to him and said, "Hey, you're the only guy around here that has any military experience. Why don't you be the general, the leader of this army, this improvised army that's hanging around on the outskirts of Boston?" And of course, Washington accepted. Let's face it, that's what he wanted to begin with. All right. So this is, if you want to think of it from terms of Zinn and Schweikart, as far as capitalism and all that good stuff, here's what has happened and how close we were financially to Britain, which is kind of ironic that then we go to war versus Britain because our economies are so tied to each other. The blue line are imports, meaning goods that are bought and brought into the country, and then exports being goods that are sold out of the country. As you know from the mercantilist system, these goods are almost always coming and going to Great Britain. You can see there that the non-importation agreements, and it dips sharply in what's that, 1769. You can see it dips again in 1773, and then of course at the start of the hostilities it drops to almost zero. What you do start to see is towards the end of the war, we actually do start doing business with Great Britain again, and obviously everything kind of gets back to, I don't want to say normal, but builds up again after the war. All right, so Bunker Hill and the Hessian hirelings. So June 1775. Remember now, this is still over a year before the Declaration of Independence, shortly after Lexington and Concord. 1,500 colonists, so these are Americans, they seize Bunker Hill. The next slide has a map. I'll show you the map in a second. Bunker Hill there's two hills. There's Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. They're on. It's kind of like I have here written a small island. It's really a peninsula, but it looks like an island in Boston Harbor, just north of what's nowadays downtown Boston. But back then it was, Boston. And from these hills, you could shoot artillery and stuff like that at any of the ships that are trying to get into Boston. You can even, I think, hit some of the shore of Boston. So we seize the high ground. It's actually Breed's Hill that we seize, but historians have gotten it wrong initially, and it was popularized as Bunker Hill. So Bunker Hill is actually Breed's Hill. Breed's Hill is actually Bunker Hill, but it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill nonetheless. The British launch a frontal assault with 3,000 soldiers, so 2-to-1 odds in their favor, and the Americans are hiding behind fences and hastily created little, boulders and stuff, and they just destroy wave after wave after wave of these British soldiers. They actually kill over 40% of the British soldiers. Eventually, the Americans run out of gunpowder and they're forced to retreat. So technically it's a British victory because they seize the ground, but this becomes a huge, from a strategic standpoint, a victory for the Americans, and from a public relations standpoint, a huge victory for the Americans, just because they performed so well against the British soldiers and inflicted so much damage. I believe I read once that more British officers died in the Battle of Bunker Hill than all other battles combined in the Revolutionary War. So some big deaths on the British side. Despite this, 1 month later, the Continental Congress, the American Congress, uh, passes the Olive Branch Petition, and they send it to King George in England, professing that the Americans, we are still loyal to the crown. We still believe that he's the king, and we want to be Englishmen, and basically begging the king to prevent further hostilities. 1 month later, King George basically says, "Screw you! If you are loyal British subjects, then quit attacking." And so he formally proclaims the colonies in rebellion. So we are officially at war as of August 1770. All right, so here is Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. So what you can see here is this is actually Bunker Hill up here in the upper left, and this is Breed's Hill in the middle. Down here is Boston. Okay, so it's a fairly large plot of land. You can go there today, and there's a big monument right here. But the thing to know is that it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the fighting is all in this area right here. So you can see, eventually, this is where the British land, right? And they're all trying to take the high ground from the Americans. The Americans are able to defend themselves for a long time. And at the end of the day, it was really only because the Americans ran out of gunpowder that they were forced to retreat. This is the scene from your book of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and you can see that's probably not too accurate, but the wave after wave of British attacks and how nice all the dead Brits right down there. All right, so now you get Thomas Paine and Common Sense. Common Sense is a political pamphlet printed in 1776. It's by far the most influential pamphlet in American history. It discusses the nature of government first, and it says that there's two types of states, or two types of governments, lawful governments and unlawful governments. And that lawful governments get their power from the consent of the people. So in other words, the people decide, hey, you get to be the legitimate government. Unlawful governments are going to be ones that impose their will on the people. He then goes on in this pamphlet to say that nowhere in the universe does a smaller body control the larger one. And he even goes into astronomy with the Earth doesn't control the sun, but vice versa, because the Earth is smaller than the sun being the bigger part, and all that. Now, the parallel is that America geographically is much larger than Britain, and the populations at this point are getting very, very close to each other. As a result of all of this, it's, quote, common sense that America should be free from Britain. And this becomes basically a big commercial to the American population that their true cause is independence, not reconciliation. So all that Olive Branch Petition stuff was worthless. That what we should be doing is declaring our independence from Great Britain. And he sells hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these pamphlets. And basically every person in America either had read this pamphlet or knew of its contents, because this was all that anybody could talk about during this early 1776 period. So it really becomes the argument in favor of independence. Oh, getting back to Paine. So Paine calls not simply for independence, but he wants a new kind of society. And he kind of goes all the way back to Plato and the Republic. So you're not having a pure democracy where everybody gets to vote for everything, for every issue, for every law, but people actually vote in members of the government. And then those members of the government actually pass the laws and make the decisions. So this is called a republic. So it's democratic in nature, but also retains certain elements of an aristocracy, I guess, to run the government. Now, this is very popular already in America, because in New England, in these towns, they already had almost 200 years of experience doing this type of thing, where they would meet at town meetings and they would debate and vote on issues like where to build a bridge and how to fund it. So and so is clearing a field over here, so how can we divvy that up, that type of thing. In addition to that, America never had a hereditary aristocracy. So whereas there was no political mobility in Britain, you had to be born into your lordship in the House of Lords and Parliament and stuff like that. In America, that simply wasn't the case. All right, so what are the strategies? For the Americans, the military strategy is to try and make this war so unsavory for the British, so costly for the British, that eventually the British are going to get tired of it. It's a war of attrition. You got to remember, the Americans are fighting on their home turf, whereas the British have to fight across, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 miles of open ocean, and that's going to be extremely costly. Even think in today's instances, we're so much more powerful than Iraq or Afghanistan, and yet it's cost uh, America well over $1 trillion, and America basically got sick and fighting these places. Guerrilla tactics. Again, this is on the home turf. You fight an insurgent war. Instead of standing in the open field with 100 guys saying ready, aim, fire, you basically hide in the woods and try and shoot the British in the back. Similar to kind of guerrilla tactics that America faces. The shoe's really on the other foot nowadays, where America is in the role of the British, and many of the countries that we're fighting, they're in the role of the rebels. Make an alliance with one of Britain's enemies. Britain was the big dog on the block, and so you want to form an alliance and get military and financial aid from the people who are jealous or hate or have a history of vengeance or want to have vengeance against the British. And of course, who's the chief one of that? We'll just look right back to the French and Indian War, and we want to get France as our ally. The rest of Europe, also for various reasons, wanted to see Britain knocked down a peg, and so we attempted to secure alliances with them also. For the British, you want to do also just like we tried to do a divide and conquer type deal, so did the British. So they want to break the colonies in half by getting in between the North and the South. And there's so many locales throughout America that are kind of loyalist strongholds. And so they thought that if they could isolate the rebel strongholds and connect the loyalist strongholds, it would be easy for the British to kind of eat away at the American resistance. Blockade the ports to prevent the flow of goods and supplies from an ally. Britain had the biggest, most mighty navy around in the world at this time, and if we're trying to make alliances with foreign countries, that's all well and good, except that we need to get their military, we need to get their food, their gunpowder, their other military supplies from those countries. And if the British are able to blockade that, then who really cares if we form an alliance? Also, the divide and conquer loyalists thing. That's pretty much the same as the top. Here are some of the early events that are happening early on in the war, 1776 and 1777. What you can see here, you got Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston here early on, and then once the British arrive and Washington's trying to defend Long Island, there's a huge battle here. Washington loses. He barely gets off of Long Island, makes it to Manhattan. Gets creamed in Manhattan, barely escapes north of the Hudson River. And then he's basically on the retreat, on the retreat, on the retreat, all the way across the Delaware River. And that's when you get the famous battles of Trenton and Princeton there. And then in the meantime, he winters there. The next year, Howe, that's the British general, he takes the ships and he tries to destroy the American government in Philadelphia, which he does. The American government is forced to flee, and then he basically just kind of hangs out in this area for a long time. The Americans, on the other hand, they try and invade Canada. They thought that Canada would become a new colony, a new state, and they lose. And then the British, on the other hand, they try basically a three-pronged attack, and that fails miserably, specifically with the Battle of Saratoga, right here, October 17, 1777, which we're going to talk about. Just gives you an overview of There's a picture of Thomas Paine right there from your book. He obviously spends a lot of time on his hair. You can see it's quite the flowing mane. Probably not as much time as Roderick spends in the morning, but almost as much. So what were his headaches? The problem was that only 1/3 of the colonists were in favor of the war for independence. This is a minority revolution, as many revolutions actually were. The other third were loyalists. There were people who didn't want America to secede, and in many cases actively aided the British, even fighting against their fellow Americans. The final third were neutral, the people who just didn't care, hoped that nothing would hurt their family, their property. For the most part, these were the people that were out west, out in the woods, out on the western frontier. They had their own problems to deal with. They really had no business with the British to begin with. State and colony loyalties. So now, of course, once they declare independence, they're not going to be called colonies anymore. They're going to become states, and they're still. I mean, you're going to see this even into the Civil War, that the unity, the identification to your particular local community, in this case colony, is going to be much stronger than this intercolonial or interstate unity. Continental Congress, the Second Congress becomes the Continental Congress. It didn't have the power to tax people, right? I mean, they could beg for money, they could borrow money, but they couldn't force people to pay money. And soldiers very often are not going to be doing this for free, especially because they have businesses and farms of themselves to tend to. So how do you pay this Continental Army? That's a big problem that Congress dealt with throughout the course of the war. The soldiers themselves were not soldiers. They were just farmers with guns, and they had no real military skills. And that is until this guy you see here, Baron von Steuben, who was kind of a Prussian con artist, to be honest with you. He wasn't even one of the heads of the Prussian army, but he saw that there was a war happening in the New World. He came over, kind of sweet talked himself into Washington's inner circle, and it turns out though that he actually was very good at whipping men into soldiers in camp, and with the drills and the different routines on how to ready aim fire, and creating stuff that soldiers need to do to fight against the mighty British army. So even though he was a liar as to his background, he ends up being crucial to the American success, especially early on in the war. There's a picture of the big guy himself, General George Washington. This painting is drawn wildly out of scale to show that Washington just towers over everybody. But he was over 6 feet tall, and he was a pretty big and imposing person. The key thing to know with Washington is that he was not a good military strategist. In fact, he lost almost every single battle he was ever in. But what he learns is that he's not a very good military strategist. So he ends up doing calculated and fairly intelligent retreats, and he keeps pulling the British army deeper and deeper inland and elongating the war, because it's going to cost Britain, since they have to fund this war from so far across the world, that really delays it. He's also a good leader of men, and so even though he's losing all these battles and his men have no shoes in the middle of winter and they're not really eating well and all this other stuff, they still loved him and were willing to follow him. So he was able to maintain this cohesive army, despite the fact that it was a crappy army and he was a crappy general. But he was just a good leader. All right, so Thomas Jefferson is a member of this Continental Congress in 1776, and he is given the task of drafting an explanation for independence, a declaration of independence, in other words. And the whole point of it was to explain to the rest of the world why America declares independence. Now, first things first, this Congress actually votes for independence on July 2nd, 1776. So our actual birth date isn't July 4th, it's actually July 2nd. This is when our government, if you could call it that, actually votes to secede from Great Britain. 2 days later, they approve of this draft, and Thomas Jefferson had been working on this, basically a letter to the rest of the world for the last few weeks, and it was edited. Some stuff on slavery and stuff like that was taken out, but the Congress then votes to say, yep, that's a good letter, and it's the Explanation of Independence. It's like a commercial to the rest of the world on why they should support America. Now, the ironic thing is, if you hold up a copy of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, you also look at John Locke and his theories of government, a little bit of Rousseau on his theories of government. These are important political philosophers. Thomas Jefferson just blatantly cuts and pastes from these three texts, and that's the Declaration of Independence. In addition to that, all of the stuff, and there's like a line item grievances that we have against Britain is the second half of the Declaration. That stuff was all just voted on by Congress and discussed in Congress. Jefferson didn't come up with any of this stuff on his own. So Jefferson has this huge claim to fame for authoring the Declaration of Independence, and I would argue he didn't author really anything. He just threw some fancy synonyms in there from some more famous, influential, smarter writers than himself. I have other issues with Thomas Jefferson, but we'll get to those in the chapters to come. But so for now, he's a plagiarist. There's King George. Good for him. Patriots and Loyalists. Again, this is kind of redundant, but the American Revolution was a minority movement. You can see the red areas there are areas of Loyalist strongholds. Then you get the purple, for the most part, are where the rebels are kind of throughout. Now, what you see there, though, is all that pink. All that pink is either Indian territory, Spanish territory, or Canada. And so there's a lot of stuff that the rebels have to deal with. And what do the rebels do? Right? But there's lots of fighting in between the rebels and the loyalists. And you can see this is an early political cartoon. Not very exciting. Here's another political cartoon. Remember, the Americans are always depicted in these early ones as Indians. The British really viewed us as just part of this savage New World Indian group, even though they're the descendants and immigrants from England for the most part. So you have here, this is a British person. It says, "Ungrateful Britons, to abandon thus your loyal friends." And then the Indian says, "No to the devil," whatever. This is a famous, I like this picture. It tells this true story that there's a statue that was built about King George. This is supposedly King George up here. That was made in 1776 after they got rid of the Stamp Act. And we're like, yay, Stamp Act is awful. Thank you, King George. And of course, then they yank it down at the start of the Revolutionary War, and they melt the statue down into bullets to be used against the king's troops. So I kind of like. This is the famous painting from everywhere of George Washington crossing the Delaware River in the middle of the night, even though it doesn't look very night there, on Christmas night to basically surprise the drunken Hessian soldiers at Trenton the next morning. It is a big battle. It's been determined that this is just kind of a nonsense picture, but it's cool nonetheless. All right, so here are some of the stuff about General Washington. We've already talked a little bit about the Battle of Long Island in the fall of 1776. The Americans are going to try and defend Long Island. Well, they get flanked, they get crushed. The American soldiers, this is before von Steuben, they just, every time they see a British soldier, they just retreat basically. And so Washington is forced to retreat to Manhattan. Then, of course, he tries to defend Manhattan, which is a colossal blunder, and they're getting crushed. Manhattan suspiciously catches on fire. A lot of people think that Washington set fire to Manhattan, and because it was such a loyalist stronghold, the British soldiers are forced to try and put out these fires. In the meantime, it creates a diversion for Washington to retreat north across the river. Basically, for the rest of the fall, he keeps getting chased all over the place by the British until he crosses the Delaware River, when the British say, okay, he's done for the year. He's going to freeze to death over there, and I think it's in New Jersey. Let's just chill out and wait till the spring to commence hostilities. So Washington realizes that it's going very badly, that they are going to lose. And so on December 26, 1776, this is the surprise attack at the very early morning hours of Trenton, and he captures 1,000 Hessians. A week later, Washington defeats a small British force in nearby Princeton. And these two battles, they kind of saved the day for Washington. And from a public opinion standpoint, public opinion, which had been dipping really, really bad with all these early defeats, it gets boosted just enough to prevent the remaining soldiers from deserting, and just enough to get new soldiers kind of. Okay, Burgoyne's blundering invasion. So the battles that occur throughout the spring and the summer of 1777, they're going very badly for the Americans once again. And the British hatch a plan where they're going to have a three-pronged attack from Canada, invading basically the upstate New York area. And there's lots of details to this that you don't need to know, but basically the point of this slide is to show you the Battle of Saratoga. And the Battle of Saratoga takes place upstate New York, October 17, 1777, after a bunch of like smaller battles in the woods and on a lake. General Burgoyne is forced to surrender his entire command to American General Horatio Gates. This is an epic victory. Notice again that the big military victories aren't earned by George Washington, they're by other generals. But in this case, again, just like in 1776, the support was falling. Right? Soldiers were deserting. Europe was refusing to recognize America as an independent nation. And then all of a sudden, boom, Saratoga happens. Now, in the meantime, we had ambassadors in France, including Benjamin Franklin, and they are able to secure the recognition from France that America is an independent country, and they basically form a treaty, and so they're the first ones. Later on, some of the other European countries fall in the line, but that's what you need to know about the Battle of Saratoga, is that it's a big American victory, and it causes the first European country to give us aid, and that being France. This is just a map of that three-pronged attack, culminating in the Battle of Saratoga right here. Britain wasn't the only, or I say Britain also realized that Saratoga was big, and it was a big loss. So here we are. It's still 1777. Thinking ahead, we don't actually end this war until 1783. But Parliament basically gives the Americans what they originally wanted in 1776, just a year or so earlier, and that's basically a home rule. So we would still be a colony of Great Britain, but we would kind of be independent in the way we ran our country. They did this because they wanted this war to end also. France, of course, signs the treaty with us because they want to hurt England. And Benjamin Franklin is able to, play this fear of the French, of us going back to Britain, against the French, and so they are very quick, and they actually give us this treaty because they want to destroy Britain's ability to be the big guy in the New World anymore. Because remember, France was still smarting over the French and Indian War. So as I said before, it was the first official recognition of America's independence, and it really, at the end of the day, as much as I hate to say it, we're not winning the Revolutionary War without France's military aid, and we get it because of the deal that Benjamin Franklin struck, and because of the victory at Saratoga. There's Benjamin Franklin in his famous coonskin hat, bifocals. So a year later, Spain and Holland also recognized the United States and declare war against England. At that time, John Adams, the guy who later becomes president, he travels to Holland, and Holland at the time was a collection of city-states, basically. They had like a league. It was not really a unified country. And he just went around these different city-states and basically got loans, got money so that the Americans could fight the war. 1780, a year later, Russia organizes what's called the armed neutrality for most of the rest of Europe against England. So they kind of dipped their toe into the waters of helping America, but not completely. But it was very, I'll say, hostile neutrality towards England. They definitely made it known that they were supporting America as opposed to Britain. So here's what the World War, the Revolutionary War ends up being, looks like. So Great Britain, some Loyalists, Indians, and 30,000 Hessians. Total population on British side about 8 million. And then you have on the other side the Americans, the belligerents, total population of 39.5 million. But that includes France, Spain, and Holland, right? And since most of the fighting is fought in America, we're really talking mostly the United States population. And remember, many of them are loyalists and Indians. And then at the bottom there, you got members of the Armed Neutrality, led by Russia. And the nice one is here it says Ireland is restive, whatever the hell that means. So the second half of the war, Britain decides to turn its strategy to the south. And there's two reasons for this. They're going to try and break apart the country into northern and southern halves to try and isolate the two. They also thought that there were many more loyalists in the south and it'd be easier to go there. And it was also the kind of the economic heart of the country at the time was agriculture, especially things like tobacco and cotton. The British won a small number of victories, but the problem for the British is there's no real big cities. You're just capturing villages and towns, but people can just leave the villages and towns. As long as the opposition army is intact in the woods, you're not really accomplishing a lot. And this was a tale that we'll study later on in the course that it happened to us in Vietnam. And to a lesser extent, it's happening to us in Afghanistan, where we can control, the big cities easily. But, we have this rebel force that dresses like civilians, and they're kind of just waiting in the woods to shoot you in the back. It's tough to win that type of war. We had another excellent U.S. general in the South here, Nathaniel Greene. If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, Mel Gibson's character is kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different. He doesn't exist in real life. The Patriot is very untrue as far as history goes. But they smushed together a couple, two or three cool guys from the South, and Nathaniel Greene is one of them. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, is another one. But you'll see the Battle of the Cowpens is very similar to the Battle of the Cowpens and Culver Courthouse are kind of the culmination of the climax of that movie, The Patriot. So they kind of smushed two battles together. 1780 is kind of a rough year for the Americans. Probably our best northern general, General Benedict Arnold, turns traitor. He joins the British. He was kind of jealous of George Washington and thought he should have been paid more and thought he should have been given more credit for that initial Canada push early on in the war. And so he plots with the British to basically turn over West Point, which was at that time a fort on the Hudson River. For obvious reasons, it'd be a pretty strategic spot. He's discovered and he flees to Britain. 1781, our guy, General Nathan Greene, he develops a strategy similar to Washington, where basically when the British army would show up, you would skirmish with them, but then retreat, and always retreat kind of deeper into the wilderness. Makes it more costly, and then you can have the guys in your army, skirmishers and whatnot, kind of destroy the supply lines of the British. It ends up clearing most of Georgia and South Carolina of British troops. Alright, so this is a map of the last, like I said, 1780 and 1781. And it shows you that there's a lot of stuff going on, and it ends up being, turns out very well for the Americans because of Yorktown right here. So what happens is the French finally come together and they send a bunch of military supplies. They land a French army and most importantly the French Navy. In the meantime, you got Cornwallis right here, who's doing the Southern campaign. You can see how General Greene had lured them more and more and more into the interior. You can see there's a bunch of little small American victories here. The ones on the coast are British victories basically because of the Navy. And this is always bleeding Cornwallis of supplies and men. And so in May of 1781, Cornwallis basically comes up here to the north. There's some more troop movements, and then he goes to Yorktown. And he goes to Yorktown because he needs resupplies from Britain. He needs more men. He needs more food, ammo, all that good stuff. In the meantime, you got de Grasse, the French military sea captain. Uh, he comes up from the West Indies, and there's a big naval battle between the French and the British here, right off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. It's huge in that the French actually win, which is ironic because they never win anything. But what happens then is Cornwallis is kind of stuck here in Yorktown, and the French ships are right off the coast, kind of blockading it. So word gets to Washington and the French General Rochambeau, who are up here by New York, that Cornwallis is basically trapped. And so they march as fast as they can, and they get to Yorktown. Yorktown becomes this, even though not a whole lot of fighting occurred, it becomes this huge battle because, as you can see here, Cornwallis is forced to surrender his troops. And that's pretty much it then for the Southern armies. I mean, Cornwallis was it. And so there's still the British armies up here, but it's just a matter of time. And so even though the war continues for another 2 years, the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781 is usually considered to be the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. This is just a text version of what I just said. You can see here that Cornwallis was forced to surrender his entire force of 7,000 soldiers, which was big in 1781. So I went to Yorktown this past summer, and there's this famous redoubt, and it's up here. So this is right on a cliff, and this was a British kind of earth fort, and you can see the little stakes sticking out to stop soldiers from attacking them. And what happens is the Americans and the French, they dig a bunch of trenches, and they get closer and closer and closer. And there's a fort here, and then about, I don't know, maybe 200 yards away, there's another fort. And so if the Americans could take this fort, and the French could take the other fort, then they could bring their cannons to these forts, and they would be close enough then basically to bomb the city of Yorktown. And so in the middle of the night, there's kind of like this frontal assault, and this one is actually led by Alexander Hamilton that attacks this fort, and they're successful. The French are also successful, and so then what do the Americans start doing? They just start bombing the heck out of Yorktown. You can go to Yorktown. They still got a lot of buildings that were there restored, and you can actually see some of the buildings that face the south, because the town is north of these forts. They still actually have the cannonballs stuck in the side of them, or you can see the cannonball damage too. The reason that I put this house in here is this is kind of a house in the middle of the countryside, maybe a mile or so from the fort, and a mile from Yorktown, and it's actually the house that the British General Cornwallis sent his second in command, and George Washington his second in command, and they actually negotiated the surrender of Yorktown at this house. So it's a pretty important place in American history. This is the stupid picture from your book about the Battle of Yorktown. You really learn a hell of a lot. All right, Peace of Paris. So France, remember the whole time, they're not like huge friends of ours. They just were big enemies of Great Britain. And so at the end of the day, they wanted an independent U.S. They wanted to pull the U.S. away from Great Britain, but they basically wanted us to be like a client of France. And so, as part of the treaty that we signed with France, is we agreed that we would have any treaties that we signed with Great Britain okayed by them ahead of time. Well, that's an attack on our sovereignty. And John Jay, who let's face it, American Congress told John Jay to adhere to the treaty with France because we didn't want to piss off France. Well, he's the American ambassador, and he ignores Congress, and he talks directly with Britain, and so he's the one that kind of hammers out the treaty with Britain. From Britain's perspective, remember they speak English, right? There are more natural allies than the French. They hate the French, and they definitely don't want to see us become a client of France. So they were very eager to entice us away from our new French friends. In addition to that, this war was costing them a ton. The British people didn't want this war anymore. Sound familiar? And so they hurriedly agreed to John Jay's demands. I guess they negotiated, but it was a sweeter deal than we probably should have had. This is the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So Britain formally recognizes the independence of the U.S. That's important because we were their rebels beforehand. On the other side, the Americans agreed that the Loyalists would not be persecuted and that Loyalist property should be restored. For the most part, this did not happen. Once people took the land or property, they kept it. Also, we agreed that the states would attempt to get the debtors, the people who owed money to the British, to get them to pay. And again, for the most part, they didn't do this. So a lot of these, there's some loose ends that are tied up again in a treaty that we signed in the 1790s, and there's still loose ends that are really finally resolved in the War of 1812, several years from now. So here we go. Here's a political cartoon from the day. Once again, or as always, America is depicted as an Indian woman. It says, "Dear Mama, say no more about it." And there's England saying, "Be a good girl and give me a bus," which is 1780s slang for a kiss. And lastly, the last slide of the lecture, the chronology. And you can see how the slow start of the American Revolutionary War actually occurs in 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Second Continental Congress is formed and starts to meet. You get the Battle of Bunker Hill. George formally proclaims the colonies in rebellion, and there's that ill-fated invasion of Canada, which doesn't work. 1776, you get Thomas Paine, who writes Common Sense, and let's face it, wrote the words to the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson stole from him. And you get the Battle of Trenton. That's the one where Washington crosses the river on Christmas in the cold. 1777, the biggest battle you need to know is the Battle of Saratoga, because that gets French military aid and they recognize our independence.